A quiet question most people never ask. Have you ever noticed that at certain points in your life, you start seeing things differently, but you can't fully explain why? Not in some dramatic, life-altering way, not like a movie moment, but something quieter, subtle, almost like your perspective shifts just enough that the world you've always known starts to feel slightly unfamiliar. You still go to the same places, talk to the same people, follow the same routines. But internally, something isn't the same. And the strange part is, you don't always know when it started. It's not tied to a single event. It's more like a gradual realization that your mindset, your reactions, even your priorities, don't quite match the environment around you anymore. Some people brush that feeling off. Others sit with it. And a small number of people start asking deeper questions, not because they're trying to feel special, but because they're trying to understand themselves. This idea of the 144,000 chosen has been interpreted in many ways over time. But instead of treating it as something literal or exclusive, what if we approached it differently? What if we looked at it as a metaphor for a certain kind of internal awareness, a pattern of growth, a mindset shift that only some people recognize in themselves? Not better, not superior, just different. And maybe the real question isn't whether you're chosen. Maybe the real question is, do you recognize these patterns in your own life? When you start feeling out of sync with familiar spaces, there's a moment that many people experience, but rarely talk about. It's when environments that once felt normal suddenly start to feel draining. It could be social gatherings, workplaces, even conversations that used to feel easy. Nothing outwardly changes, but internally something does. You begin to notice the tone of conversations more, the repetition, the lack of depth, the automatic responses people give without really thinking. And it doesn't make you angry. It just doesn't resonate anymore. At first, this can feel confusing. You might wonder if something's wrong with you, if you're becoming distant, if you're losing interest in things you used to enjoy. But often, this isn't about disconnection. It's about awareness. When your perspective starts evolving, your tolerance for certain environments shifts too. Not because those environments are bad, but because they no longer match where you are mentally. And that mismatch creates friction. Some people respond by forcing themselves to fit back in. Others start creating space. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just small, intentional distance. And over time, that space becomes clarity. The shift from reacting to observing. One of the more subtle changes that happens during personal growth is how you respond to situations. There was a time when things triggered immediate reactions. Someone says something, you respond instantly. Something goes wrong, you feel it deeply right away. But gradually, something changes. You start noticing a gap, a pause between what happens and how you respond. In that pause, something new exists, awareness. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin observing. You notice tone, intent, patterns. You realize that not everything requires a response. And more importantly, not everything deserves your energy. This doesn't mean you stop feeling things. It means you stop being controlled by every feeling. And that shift changes everything. Because once you can observe without immediately reacting, you gain something most people never fully develop: control over your own state of mind. Why you start questioning things you once accepted. There's a stage where you begin revisiting ideas you used to accept without thinking. Beliefs, habits, social expectations. Not because you're trying to rebel, but because you're trying to understand. You start asking, why do I think this way? Where did this belief come from? Do I actually agree with it, or have I just never questioned it? This process can feel uncomfortable because it removes the certainty that once made life feel simple. But it also creates something more valuable: clarity. Instead of operating on autopilot, you begin making conscious choices. And those choices start shaping a version of you that feels more aligned. Not perfect, not complete, but real. The loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of personal transformation. The loneliness. But it's not the kind people usually think of. It's not about having no one around you. It's about feeling like fewer people truly understand how you see things now. You can be surrounded by others and still feel like your internal world is different. Conversations feel surface level. Connections feel temporary. And you start craving something deeper, not more people, just more meaning. This can be difficult to navigate because there's no clear solution. You can't force deeper connections. You can only become more honest about what you're looking for. And in that honesty, something interesting happens. You stop chasing connection, and you start recognizing it when it naturally appears. When growth becomes a priority without you realizing it. At some point, you stop needing external motivation to grow. You don't need someone to push you. You don't need constant reminders. There's just an internal pull. You start paying more attention to your habits, your time, your energy, not in a rigid or obsessive way, but in a conscious one. You begin to notice what drains you and what strengthens you. And slowly, your decisions start reflecting that awareness. You choose differently. Not always perfectly, but more intentionally. And over time, those small choices create a completely different direction. The realization that not everything needs to be explained. Earlier in life, there's often a need to explain yourself. Your choices, your boundaries, your changes. You want people to understand, to agree, to validate. But as your perspective shifts, something else becomes clear. Not everyone needs an explanation. And not everyone will understand, even if you give one. This realization isn't about becoming distant. It's about becoming grounded. You stop over-explaining. You stop justifying every decision. And instead, you start trusting your own reasoning. That quiet confidence becomes more powerful than any external validation. A different relationship with time. One of the deeper changes that happens is how you view time. Before, time might have felt like something to fill. Now, it starts to feel like something to protect. You become more aware of how quickly moments pass, how easily time is spent on things that don't matter, and how valuable it becomes when used intentionally. This doesn't mean you become overly serious. It means you become selective. You start asking, is this worth my time? Is this moving me forward or just keeping me busy? And those questions shape how you live your days. Identities shift, becoming someone you didn't expect. At some point, you realize something subtle but powerful. You're not the same person you used to be. Not because you tried to become someone else, but because you allowed yourself to evolve. Your priorities changed. Your mindset expanded. Your reactions became more measured. And your sense of identity became less dependent on external opinions. This can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because growth often creates distance between who you were and who you're becoming. But over time, that distance turns into clarity. You begin to understand yourself in a way you never did before. Not as a fixed identity, but as something continuously developing. So when people ask, are you one of the 144,000 chosen? Maybe the answer isn't something you declare. Maybe it's something you quietly reflect on. Not as a label, not as a status, but as a way of recognizing patterns within yourself. Growth, awareness, change. These aren't things reserved for a select group. They're processes. And if you've experienced even a few of these shifts, then you're already on a path that most people eventually encounter, just at different times in different ways. So instead of asking whether you belong to something, it might be more meaningful to ask, how much have you changed, and what does that change mean to you? If any part of this resonated with your own experience, I'd be interested to hear how your perspective has shifted over time. When you stop chasing validation without noticing, there's a quiet turning point that doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one day and decide, I no longer need validation. It happens more subtly than that. At first, you still look for it, in conversations, in reactions, in how people respond to your choices. You notice when someone agrees with you. You feel a slight lift when your decisions are acknowledged. But gradually, something shifts. You start making choices before asking for opinions. You start trusting your instincts without needing immediate confirmation. And one day, you realize you didn't check how anyone felt about what you did. Not because you don't care, but because your decisions finally feel like they belong to you. This doesn't make you distant or disconnected. It makes you independent in a way that feels calm, not forced. And that calm independence changes how you move through the world. The awareness of energy in conversations. At some point, you begin noticing something you never paid attention to before. Energy. Not in a mystical sense, but in a psychological one. You notice how certain conversations leave you feeling clear, focused, and engaged, and others leave you mentally drained, even if nothing negative was said. You start picking up on patterns. Who interrupts constantly? Who listens with intention? Who speaks just to respond, and who speaks to understand? And without consciously deciding, you begin adjusting your interactions. You spend less time in conversations that feel heavy, more time in ones that feel balanced. This doesn't mean cutting people off abruptly. It means becoming more aware of how interactions affect your internal state. And once you see that clearly, it becomes difficult to ignore. Why you start letting go of old versions of yourself. Growth often requires something most people resist. Letting go. Not just of people or situations, but of versions of yourself that once felt familiar. The way you used to react. The habits you once justified. The identity you built around certain roles or expectations. At one point, those things made sense. They helped you navigate where you were. But as your awareness expands, some of those patterns no longer fit. And holding on to them starts to feel uncomfortable. Almost like wearing something that no longer belongs to you. Letting go isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing differently in a moment where you would repeat an old habit. Other time, it's a longer process of slowly detaching from something you've known for years. Either way, it requires honesty. Because you can't grow into something new while holding tightly to everything old. The shift from external noise to internal clarity. There was a time when your environment shaped most of your thinking. Opinions around you, trends, expectations, even the way people reacted influenced how you saw things. But over time, something changes. You start filtering information differently. Not everything gets your attention anymore. Not every opinion feels relevant. And instead of absorbing everything around you, you begin selecting what aligns with your values. This creates a kind of internal clarity. You're still aware of what's happening around you, but it doesn't control your perspective the way it used to. And that clarity becomes a foundation. Because when your thinking is no longer constantly influenced by external noise, Your decisions become more consistent, more intentional, more aligned with who you actually are. When you realize growth is always comfortable, there's a misconception that growth feels inspiring all the time, that it's motivating, exciting, and full of clarity. But the reality is often different. Growth can feel uncertain, uncomfortable, even isolating at times, because every step forward requires you to face something you didn't see before. A pattern, a limitation, a truth you might have avoided. And facing those things isn't easy. But it's necessary, because real growth doesn't come from avoiding discomfort. It comes from understanding it, from sitting with it long enough to learn something from it. And over time, you begin to see discomfort differently, not as something to escape, but as something that signals change. The subtle confidence that replaces the need to prove. Earlier in life, there's often a need to prove something. Your worth, your intelligence, your abilities. You want recognition, acknowledgement, confirmation that you're on the right path. But as your perspective shifts, something else takes its place. A quieter form of confidence, one that doesn't need constant validation. You still care about doing things well. You still aim to improve. But you're no longer driven by the need to prove yourself to everyone around you. And that changes how you carry yourself. You speak when you have something meaningful to say. You act without over-explaining your intentions. And you stop measuring your value based on how others respond. That kind of confidence isn't loud, but it's steady. When you start seeing patterns instead of isolated events, one of the deeper shifts in awareness is pattern recognition. Before, situations might have felt random, unrelated, just things that happened. But over time, you start connecting dots. You notice recurring behaviors, both in yourself and others. You see how certain choices lead to similar outcomes, how certain environments produce similar feelings. And that awareness gives you something powerful, the ability to adjust. Because once you recognize patterns, you're no longer reacting blindly. You're responding with context. You begin to understand cause and effect on a deeper level. And that understanding allows you to make changes that are actually meaningful. Not temporary, not reactive, but intentional. The moment you realize you can redefine your direction, at some point, a realization begins to form. Your life isn't as fixed as it once seemed. The path you're on isn't permanent. The identity you've built isn't final. And while that realization can feel overwhelming at first, it's also freeing. Because it means you're not stuck. You're not limited to one version of yourself. You have the ability to shift direction, to choose differently, to build something new. And that doesn't require a dramatic restart. It starts with small decisions, new habits, different priorities. Over time, those small changes create a completely different trajectory, a deeper understanding of what actually matters. As your perspective evolves, your definition of important changes. Things that once felt urgent start to feel less significant, and things you once overlooked begin to matter more. Time with the right people, moments of clarity, peace of mind. You start valuing depth over appearance, meaning over distraction. And this shift simplifies things, not because life becomes easier, but because your focus becomes clearer. You stop trying to keep up with everything and start focusing on what actually aligns with you. So when you come back to the original question, are you one of the 144,000 chosen? Maybe it's not about fitting into a specific number or identifying with a label that separates you from others. Maybe it's about recognizing whether you've experienced these kinds of internal shifts. The quiet changes, the subtle awareness, the moments where your perspective no longer matches who you used to be. Because those moments matter. They shape how you think, how you choose, how you grow, and most importantly, how you understand yourself. If you've noticed these patterns in your own life, then you're already engaging in a level of self-awareness that naturally leads to change. Not all at once, but consistently. And if you feel like you're still in the middle of that process, that's part of it too. Growth doesn't arrive fully formed. It develops over time. So I'm curious, what's one shift you've noticed in yourself recently that you did expect when you stopped trying to go back to who you were? There's a phase in personal growth that almost no one prepares you for. It's the moment you realize you can't go back. Not because something is physically stopping you, but because mentally, you've the version of yourself that once fit into those spaces. At first, you might try. You revisit old habits, old environments, old ways of thinking. But something feels off. What once felt normal now feels forced. What once felt natural now requires effort. And that's when it becomes clear, growth isn't just about becoming something new. It's also about losing the ability to comfortably return to what no longer fits. This realization can feel unsettling, but it's also a sign of progress, because it means your awareness has expanded beyond a point where old patterns can fully hold you anymore. The responsibility that comes with awareness. As your awareness grows, something else grows with it. Responsibility. Not in a heavy or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, undeniable sense. You start realizing that once you see something clearly, it's hard to ignore it. If you recognize a pattern in your behavior, you can't pretend it's not there. If you understand what's draining your energy, you can't keep engaging with it the same way. Awareness removes the comfort of ignorance and replaces it with choice. You can still choose what you do next, but now those choices feel more intentional, more conscious, and over time, that sense of responsibility shapes your actions in ways that feel more aligned with who you're becoming. When your standards change without announcement, you don't sit down one day and write new rules for your life. Your standards don't change through a single decision. They shift gradually, quietly, through experience, reflection, and awareness. You begin expecting more from your environment, your time, your interactions. Not in a demanding way, but in a self-respecting one. You stop accepting things that once felt normal, not because you're judging them differently, but because they no longer match your internal standard. And this change often goes unnoticed by others. But you feel it in the choices you make, in the situations you walk away from, in the things you no longer tolerate. It's a silent upgrade in how you live your life. The inner stability that starts replacing external control. There was a time when your mood depended heavily on external factors. How people treated you, how situations turned out, what was happening around you. And while those things still affect you, they no longer define your entire state. Because something else begins to develop. Inner stability. A sense of balance that isn't easily shaken. You still experience highs and lows, but they don't control you the way they once did. You recover faster. You process things differently. You don't stay stuck in the same emotional cycles for as long. And that stability becomes one of the most valuable parts of your growth, because it allows you to move through life with a level of consistency that isn't dependent on everything going perfectly. When you realize growth is an ongoing process, at some point, you stop looking for a final version of yourself. You stop thinking in terms of "I'll arrive when," because you begin to understand something deeper. There is no final version. There's no point where everything is complete, figured out, or perfectly aligned. There's only progression, adjustment, refinement. And instead of chasing a fixed outcome, you start focusing on the process itself. Learning, improving, understanding. That shift removes pressure, because you're no longer trying to reach an endpoint. You're building something that evolves over time. And that perspective makes growth feel less like a race and more like a continuous path. The way you start trusting yourself differently. Trusting yourself isn't something that happens instantly. It develops through experience, through decisions, through moments where you choose based on your understanding rather than external influence. And over time, that trust becomes stronger. You second-guess yourself less. You hesitate less. You rely more on your own judgment. Not because you think you're always right, but because you've learned from enough experiences to navigate uncertainty more confidently. And that trust becomes a foundation. Because when you trust yourself, you don't feel lost as easily. Even when things are unclear, you know you can figure them out. Final reflection, it was never about a number. So when everything circles back to that original idea, the 144,000 chosen, maybe it was never meant to be taken as a literal number. Maybe it was never about counting people, separating groups, or assigning labels. Maybe it's simply a way people have tried to describe a certain kind of internal shift, a pattern of awareness, a process of growth, a way of seeing things that develops over time. And if you've recognized yourself in these experiences, even partially, then you're already engaging with that process. Not as something exclusive, but as something personal, something real, something that continues to evolve. If this made you pause, even for a moment, don't rush past that. Take a second and actually think about where you are right now. Not where you were a year ago. Not where you think you should be. But where you are. What's changed in how you think? What do you see differently now that you didn't before? What have you quietly, even if no one else has noticed? That kind of reflection is where real clarity starts. And if you want to go deeper into this kind of thinking, where growth is explored honestly, without pressure or labels, then stay connected to this space. Not because you need answers handed to you, but because sometimes the right perspective at the right time helps you see your own path more clearly. And if you feel like sharing, what's one shift in your mindset that you know you can't go back from?